The air was brittle that morning, carrying the bite of late autumn across the high desert. Frost lay in thin veins over the brush, and the sky was the pale grey of smoke, a sky that seemed to press down upon the earth as though it wished to crush whatever life remained. Thomas Hale walked the ravine path with the same steady, hollow stride he had carried for years. His rifle hung loosely at his side, the wood worn smooth by a hand that no longer held it with purpose but habit. His cabin waited behind him in silence, weathered planks leaning like an old man against the wind, but he did not turn back. He checked the traps every morning, because that was what one did to keep alive, though the act felt more ritual than necessity. When he reached the snare beneath the cedar, he expected a rabbit or nothing at all. Instead, he stopped short. There, tangled in the iron jaws of his trap, was no creature of fur but a girl, dark-haired, no more than 19 by his measure, her braid dusted with dirt, her ankle twisted within the cruel steel. She froze when his shadow fell over her. Her eyes, black, unblinking, shone with terror and fire both, as though she expected his boot to fall, or worse. He did not move at once. He saw how she pressed her lips tight to hide pain, how her hands clenched the earth as if it could shield her. The wind moaned low through the ravine, filling the silence between them. Thomas swallowed. His mind, for the briefest moment, flicked to another woman, his wife, whose eyes had once looked at him across a fire with trust and tenderness. Those eyes had closed forever in a bed of fever, leaving him with nothing but a shawl over a chair and a cold space in his chest. He set his rifle aside. Slowly, so slowly she could see his intent, he knelt. The iron trap gleamed with frost, biting cruelly at her skin. She flinched when his hands came near, but he did not touch her at first. He studied the mechanism, then, with a careful press and strain, forced the jaws open. The trap sprang free with a sharp crack. She gasped, clutching her ankle to her chest, dragging herself backward like a cornered doe. "It's done," he said, though his voice carried more gravel than comfort. She did not answer. Words were nothing between them. Her ankle swelled before his eyes, purple blooming against her brown skin. She tried to stand, but her body betrayed her, and she staggered. He caught her before she fell. She writhed in his arms, fists pounding weakly against his chest, but she was light, so light, and her fight soon gave way to trembling. "I'll not harm you," he murmured, though the promise seemed to hang useless in the cold air. She would not believe him, not yet. Step by step, he carried her up the path. The cabin came into sight, its chimney puffing a thin wisp of smoke against the grey. The door creaked open with his shoulder, and he brought her inside. The room was dim, lit only by the smouldering fire in the hearth. The smell of old coffee lingered. A rocking chair stood in the corner, unmoving, with a shawl draped over its back like a ghost waiting to return. He set her gently on the bench near the fire. She shrank into herself, wrapping her arms tight across her body, eyes darting to the rifle mounted on the wall, to the shadows pooling in the corners. She expected cruelty. Thomas knelt again, placing a pot over the flames, the gesture quiet and practical. The only sound was the crackle of kindling, the sigh of the wind slipping through the chinks in the wall. He did not press her, did not ask her name. She did not thank him, nor soften her gaze. They sat in that silence, two souls abandoned by different storms, bound now by a single roof. Outside, the wind howled through the desert, carrying with it the promise of long nights ahead. Inside, in the dim flicker of firelight, suspicion and loneliness breathed side by side, heavier than the smoke curling toward the rafters. And so it began, not with trust, not with warmth, but with the uneasy truth that survival sometimes places strangers in each other's hands. The cabin breathed with its own silence, a silence that clung thicker than smoke. The girl sat near the fire but never close enough to yield its warmth, her shoulders stiff, her braid falling loose over one side. He had offered her stew, thin though it was, and she turned her head. When he placed a tin cup of water within her reach, she eyed it as though it might conceal a trap more cruel than iron. Her hands never wandered far from her lap, where beneath the folds of her dress a small knife rested, its presence betrayed by the quick twitch of her fingers whenever he moved too suddenly. Thomas did not press her. He had learned long ago that pressing brought nothing but more silence. His wife had once sat in that very chair by the fire, shawl wrapped about her shoulders, smiling faintly as she poured coffee into his tin cup. That shawl still lay across the chair, untouched, its folds heavy with dust. He could not bring himself to move it, for moving it meant admitting she was gone, and he was not ready to surrender even that thin memory. Above the hearth, a trunk sat hidden beneath a faded quilt. Inside it rested her wedding dress, folded away after the fever took her. Thomas had not opened it since, for the thought of her laughter stitched into the seams was too much to bear. Now, across the same hearth, another woman sat, this one young, foreign, her eyes sharpened not by sickness but by suspicion. Both presences haunted him, one with absence, the other with distrust. Naeli, he had heard her murmur the name in her sleep, soft as wind over dry grass, held herself like one who had survived more storms than her years should carry. Sometimes, when the fire burned low, her face would twist in a fleeting shadow of grief. He imagined scenes he could not know, horses thundering in the night, fire crackling through a village, a hand torn from hers in the chaos. She did not speak of it, and he did not ask. The silence between them bore too many graves already. At times, Thomas found himself staring at her as she sat rigid in the glow, and his heart thudded with an unease he did not recognize. She was not his wife returned, not a ghost, not a comfort. She was something else entirely, something that unsettled the cabin's stillness in a way both unwelcome and necessary. The days folded into each other. He chopped wood, mended fences, stoked the fire, and she remained watchful. At dusk, when coyotes yipped in the hills, she would glance toward the door, eyes wide as if she longed to run but knew her ankles still betrayed her. And one night, she tried. The moon hung thin as a blade, spilling cold light across the ground. Thomas woke to the faint scrape of wood and the creak of hinges. He reached for his rifle out of habit, then saw her figure in the doorway, limping, clutching her knife in one hand. She slipped into the night like a shadow cut free. He gave her a moment. He did not wish to frighten her further, but when he stepped outside, the frost already shone across the ground, brittle beneath his boots. He followed the broken trail of her steps until he found her collapsed near the cedar line, her breath sharp and shallow, the knife fallen useless at her side. She tried to rise when he approached, but her leg buckled, and she sank again. For the first time, he saw tears glinting in her eyes, though she turned her face away from him. Thomas did not speak. He simply slipped his coat from his shoulders and draped it across her body. She stiffened at first, then drew it tight against the cold, the trembling of her frame softening under its weight. He crouched there beside her, the night air burning his lungs, the stars bright as flint overhead. No words passed between them. He did not tell her to come back, nor did she beg for release. They remained in the frost together, two wounded figures bent under memories they could not lay down. At last, he gathered her once more in his arms, her weight slight but heavy with sorrow, and carried her back toward the dim glow of the cabin fire. The wind sighed low through the trees, carrying with it the echo of griefs too old for speech. Inside, he laid her upon the bench again, the coat still wrapped about her. She turned her face toward the wall, yet he noticed she no longer reached for the knife at her hem. He stoked the fire higher, and its light flickered across the shawl, the rocking chair, the emptiness that had once consumed him whole. In that moment, Thomas understood. Pain was not the property of one man or one people. It spread across blood and boundary alike, and sometimes, without request, compassion was the only answer left. The storm rolled in from the mountains without warning, black clouds spilling across the horizon like ink poured over paper. By the time Thomas hauled the last of the wood against the cabin wall, the wind had already turned savage, clawing at his coat, carrying needles of freezing rain that stung his face. He bolted the door just as the sky cracked with thunder, a sound that rattled the very timbers of the house. Inside, the cabin shuddered beneath each gust. Shutters banged until he secured them, and smoke swirled from the hearth as the wind pressed down the chimney. Naeli sat rigid in the corner, her dark eyes reflecting the fire's restless glow, her braid damp with blown-in rain. When the cold seeped deeper, she reached for the shawl that still hung over the rocking chair. She pulled it about her shoulders, and though Thomas said nothing, his breath caught at the sight. That shawl had once belonged to a woman who laughed beside this same fire. Now it cloaked a girl who had every reason to despise him, yet sought warmth from what little he had left. He busied himself with the coffee pot, setting it to boil though he knew she would not drink. The smell rose rich and bitter, curling into the air like memory. He poured a cup for himself, sipped slowly, the warmth cutting through the chill. The storm grew louder, rain drumming on the roof like 1,000 hoofbeats. She flinched at the thunder, and though she tried to hide it, he saw the way her fingers tightened in the shawl. Hours passed, the world outside reduced to water and raw. At last, when the wind calmed just enough, he opened the stable door to check his horse. Naeli followed, cautious but curious, limping slightly as she crossed the threshold. The horse nickered, uneasy with the storm. Thomas stroked its neck, murmuring, then noticed Naeli's eyes lingered on the coarse manet. He stepped aside without a word, offering the reins. Her hands, so tense before, moved with certainty as she began to braid the animal's manet. The horse calmed under her touch. She wove with the rhythm of one who had learned it at her mother's knee, and for the first time Thomas saw her not as a fugitive, not as a stranger, but as someone shaped by a world of her own, rituals, traditions, the ordinary gestures of care. When she finished, she glanced at him briefly, as though to measure whether he mocked her. He only nodded. Something eased in her gaze, and the cabin, when they returned, no longer felt quite as divided. Later, as thunder rolled again, he showed her the cracked kettle he had meant to mend for months. She frowned at it, then at him, then crouched by the fire with a focus that surprised him. He handed her tools, she guided his hand when he fumbled. Their fingers brushed, brief, unremarkable in motion, yet heavy with meaning in the hush between them. When she spoke, it startled him. A single word, soft and sure, in her tongue. She pointed to the kettle, repeating it until he tried. His mouth formed the sound awkwardly, but she did not laugh. She only nodded once, as if some small balance had shifted. He offered her a word in return, metal, and she repeated it, the syllables thick but true. The storm raged long into the night, shaking the shutters, rattling the walls. But inside, the fire burned steady, casting long shadows across his scarred hands and her guarded face. For the first time since her arrival, the silence between them felt less like a wall and more like a space that could be crossed. Lightning split the sky outside, yet within the cabin a quieter spark took hold, not of certainty, not yet of trust, but of something that might grow if tended carefully. The days lengthened into a rhythm that was neither peace nor battle, but something taut, stretched thin as a rope over water. Naeli moved through the cabin with a grace that made little sound. She fed the fire before it died, swept the corners with a bundle of sagebrush she had gathered, mended a torn sleeve of his coat with thread she found in a drawer. She did not ask permission, nor did she seek thanks. Thomas watched her quietly, unsure whether to feel grateful or unsettled. Each act seemed to root her deeper into the house, and yet her eyes, when they caught his, still carried the watchful distance of someone half prepared to flee. Thomas wrestled with a question that pressed harder each day. Was he protecting her, or had his roof become a cage? The thought burned in him, for he did not want to see himself reflected in the faces of men who saw only possession when they looked upon another soul. And yet, when he glanced at the door, he wondered if she stayed because of her ankle, or because some invisible thread tied her here against her will. The unease sharpened one afternoon when a knock came at the door. Thomas opened it to find a neighboring rancher, Crawford, broad-shouldered, with a mouth quick to twist into suspicion. Crawford's eyes darted past Thomas's shoulder and fixed on Naeli where she stood at the hearth. The pause lingered too long. "Thought I'd check in," Crawford said slowly, his gaze narrowing. "Storm took a few fences down my way. Didn't know you had company." The word hung in the air like a lash. Thomas stood straighter, his hand resting heavy against the doorframe. She was hurt. Needed shelter. Crawford's brow furrowed, suspicion carving his face deeper. Hurt, or caught. Can't be too careful, Hale. Folks talk. His voice lowered. You don't want to find yourself answering questions with her under your roof. Thomas's jaw tightened. I don't answer to questions not worth asking, he said, and his tone closed the matter. Still, Crawford left with a glance over his shoulder that carried warning as much as doubt. Inside, the silence grew sharper. Naeli had heard. Her chin lifted in that proud way of hers, but her eyes burned. She turned from him, shoulders drawn tight, as though the air itself had betrayed her. That night, the tension snapped. Thomas, weary from the day's wait, let slip the words he should have swallowed. You could show some measure of thanks, he said, his voice harder than intended. A roof over your head, food, fire, it is more than most would offer. Naeli whirled on him, eyes flashing. Thanks, she spat, her voice breaking the cabin's hush like glass. You think me blind? I hear how men speak of me. A burden. A danger. You think me less because I am not her. Her gaze flicked toward the shawl, toward the empty rocking chair, and the unspoken name that lived in every shadow of the house. His chest clenched. Do not speak of what you cannot know, he said, but his voice faltered. I know grief, she snapped back. I know chains. You look at me and see only what you lost. Not who I am. The word struck with more force than the storm had days before. He turned from her, fists curling at his sides, not in anger toward her but at the truth she had laid bare. She retreated as well, pulling the shawl tighter, her face hard with hurt. The fire sputtered between them, its light weak, its smoke rising to the rafters. Each claimed a corner of the room, the silence no longer heavy with suspicion alone but with the sting of words spoken too sharp. The storm outside had passed, but within the cabin, another had taken root. Neither sought sleep, neither sought reconciliation. The night stretched long, broken only by the restless crackle of wood and the ache of two souls who had struck each other where wounds were deepest. The cold came harder than either of them expected. Snow pressed against the cabin walls, muffling the world outside into silence. The windows fogged with frost, and every breath turned white in the dim air. Without the fire, they would have frozen, so Thomas kept it fed, hour after hour, stacking logs until his back ached. The flames became their heartbeat, the only proof that life persisted within these thin walls. The anger of nights before lingered still, but winter softened it. Words were scarce. Instead, gestures carried weight. When Naeli rose in the morning, she stirred the embers and laid fresh kindling without being asked. When Thomas returned from splitting wood, he found a tin cup of broth waiting on the table. No apologies were spoken, yet the rhythm of care grew steady, quiet, and true. One evening, while the storm outside shrieked against the roof, Naeli sat before the fire with her shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her fingers parted her long dark hair, weaving it into a braid that shone copper in the light. Thomas watched without meaning to, noticing how her hands no longer trembled as they had when she first entered his cabin. The braid was not just a braid, it was order reclaimed from chaos, a symbol of control, of belonging where she had once felt cornered. Later, she spoke, her voice low and halting. She told him of the raid that scattered her family, of the cries in the night, the smoke that took her father's lodge, the younger siblings she never saw again. Her words trembled, but her gaze held steady, as though daring him to turn away. He did not. He sat near, hands open on his knees, listening until the silence stretched too long. Then he answered. He spoke of his wife, of the fever that stole her breath in a matter of days, of the way her shawl still hung where she had left it, heavy with her absence. He admitted how his tools had rusted, how the rocking chair by the fire had mocked him with its stillness. He confessed that he had stopped speaking aloud at all, for there had been no one to listen. The fire cracked between them, throwing sparks up the chimney, and in those confessions, the room changed. They were no longer settler and Apache, no longer man and girl bound by accident, but two souls cast adrift by fate, each carrying scars that words could not conceal. They did not touch. They did not reach across the space. Instead, something subtler grew. When Thomas passed her a mug of coffee, her fingers brushed his briefly, and she did not recoil. When she mended the tear in his work shirt, he stood patient while her hands moved at his chest. When he stepped onto the porch, she joined him, silent, both watching the snow fall thick against the endless dark. Their bond did not declare itself in grand words. It lived in the rhythm of boots on the floorboards, in the sight of her braid glinting in firelight, in the way she folded his coat over the chair after wearing it. It lived in his steadying hand when she limped on the ice, in her quiet humming as she laid wood upon the flames. That winter, survival was not only warmth and bread. It was endurance shared, grief witnessed, dignity restored in small mercies. They had been abandoned by different storms, but together, for the first time in too long, they found a way to stand against the cold. The thaw came slow, dripping from the eaves, turning snow to mud, filling the air with the smell of damp earth. The silence of winter loosened its grip, and with it came voices Thomas had hoped never to hear. Hoofbeats, many, not just one, rolled over the valley like a drum. He stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, and saw them crest the rise, a band of riders, faces hard, rifles gleaming in the pale light. Crawford was among them, his gaze sharp with suspicion. "Hail," he called, reining in his horse. "Word is you've been harboring an Apache in your cabin. A girl. Folks don't take kindly to that. They say she scouts for raiding parties." The men shifted in their saddles, hands brushing their weapons. The spring air felt thin, stretched tight with threat. Behind Thomas, the cabin door creaked. Naeli stepped out. She did not stay hidden. She did not crouch in the shadows as she once had. She stood beside him, shawl about her shoulders, braid loose against her back, her chin lifted with a pride that did not waver. The riders muttered, the sight confirming their suspicion. Crawford's eyes narrowed. "Best hand her over, Hale. You've got no stake in her fate. You're risking your land, your life." Thomas's jaw worked. He felt the years of grief pressing on him, the weight of solitude, the empty chair by the fire. All of it rose in him now, shaping his voice into iron. "She stays," he said, quiet but unyielding. "She's no spy, no threat. She is under my roof, and that makes her under my protection." For a moment, only the wind answered. The riders stared, thunderclouds of judgment in their eyes. One man raised his rifle a fraction, but Crawford's hand stayed him. "You'll regret it, Hale." he spat, turning his horse. "You can't fight the tide alone." They rode off, hooves throwing mud, their warning trailing behind like smoke. Thomas lowered his rifle slowly. His breath came ragged, but his resolve held. Beside him, Naeli had not moved. When their eyes met, no words were needed. Something stronger than gratitude passed between them, an understanding, a bond sealed not in tenderness alone but in the face of danger. Days later, Thomas saddled his horse. The thaw had cleared the paths enough for travel, and he knew she longed for the foothills, for the chance to find her people again. He helped her mount, his hand steady at her waist, though his chest felt hollow with the thought of parting. The trail wound toward the mountains, the air alive with the smell of pine and meltwater. When the ridges of the foothills came into sight, Naeli drew the reins, halting the horse. She looked toward the land of her people, then back at the man who had carried her from frost and fire alike. Slowly, she reached for his hand, laying hers over it where it rested on the saddle horn. Her eyes spoke what neither dared say aloud: she would not return, not yet. She had chosen her place. Thomas said nothing. He only covered her hand with his own, rough and scarred, the silence between them richer than speech. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of thawed earth and distant cedar. Together they turned the horse back toward the cabin. Behind them, the mountains watched in silence. Ahead of them lay a roof weathered but waiting. Not possession, not rescue, but something quieter, steadier, a promise that survival, when shared, could become a kind of home.